Welcome to the show, Rich.
Glad to be here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject.
So, I think just to start with the basics, a lot of our audience may or not know the difference between an IEP and 504. Sometimes they use interchangeably, but both of us know that legally they're very, very different. If you could, in simple terms, explain the difference and tell when each of these is used and in what circumstances.
Project questions because I want it to be as user-friendly as possible. So often 504 plans and IEPs get lumped together as if they were the same thing or one was a continuation of the other, but they really are two separate laws. And it's important to know where the two laws came from because that helps to really understand what the two laws can do for your child. So the 504 plan is really an outcome of a civil rights law. It's a law to make sure that people with disabilities are not discriminated against, that they have a equal opportunity to access their education, their jobs, and 504 focuses on what accommodations are necessary to remove the obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
I'll come back to talk a little bit more, but let me draw the difference right away to an IEP. An IEP is an individualized education program, and that comes out of the education law. So the IEP are what are the goals and objectives that a child needs to work on to learn strategies and skills that will allow them to access their education. So the biggest difference between the two is the 504 plan really focuses on accommodations. IEP has accommodations, but also has goals and objectives which lead to specialized instruction. So, for example, a student with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
A student with ADHD might need an accommodation of sitting in the front of the room near the point of instruction or wearing headphones to block off the noise from other students that might distract them. That could be done within a 504 plan. An IEP might teach the same student how to pay better attention, how to monitor their own attention to task, how to organize their thoughts, organize their materials, all the different executive functioning skills that might be impacted by their ADHD. They're actually going to be taught skills to improve in those areas. And at some point, they may not even need the accommodations because they'll have learned the skills. They'll have learned how to be more of a self-advocate. All that would come that instruction comes through an IEP. Again, both have accommodations, but IEP has instruction that comes with teaching the skills and strategies of how to improve.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that very clear explanation, because a lot of people think that an IEP can only be given to someone who's struggling. Well, okay, let's take the example of ADHD, where the child is disruptive in class, is throwing chairs down, and an IEP is only for those kind of children and not for someone who is, let's take the example of twice exceptional. I'm sure you're very familiar with this word. So parents often struggle to prove that their child is struggling in school, whether it's because of executive functioning or emotional dysregulation, because they are doing so well in school. They're academically doing very well, right? Hey, we cannot give you an IEP or we cannot give you a 504. How do parents get over that bump?
Yeah, no, and that is a major bump, convincing schools that even a child who may be earning A's and B's, they may still need an IEP. A big tool for that came to us in 2017 when the Supreme Court voted unanimously that IEPs should look at not only academic progress, but also functional progress. So functional would take in things like executive functioning, like social communication, like behavior. So a child may be getting A's and B's, but not be effective in their communication, or may not be effective in managing their own behavior or in those executive functioning skills, and so they could still qualify for an IEP. We see this a lot with students on the spectrum. They may be very smart students, capable of understanding beyond grade level material, but yet they may not have any friends. They may be sitting alone at lunch. They may be very frustrated in their attempts to interact with other students. That student may still need an IEP. And again, the key question, going back to my first answer, is, are there skills and strategies that they need to be taught in order to make progress in school, both academically and functionally.
The school will rarely come to you and say, your child needs this. You have to advocate for your child, right? How should a parent know that 504 is sufficient or IEP is sufficient or which one is better? And let's pick the example of ADHD. Kid is doing very well academically, but cannot regulate their emotions, is struggling.
Right.
Because
So,
I personally don't understand the whole point of having a 504. I feel that every kid needs to learn those skills. Like you should teach them irrespective, right? It's not just the ones that have IEP.
mhm. Should every student have an IEP instead of a 504? I think it's true for most students if they are struggling in school, whether it be academically or with some functional skill, that they would need an IEP to make sure that they're having specialized instruction to teach them the skill.
Yeah.
There are students, though, who are really doing fine academically and functionally, but they just need ongoing accommodations. They need that seat in the front of the classroom. They need extra time to finish assignments and especially extra time on tests. That would be an appropriate time for a 504 plan if it's just the accommodation. Going back to your first part of your question when you talked about how would parents know, I think that's where a educational consultant or sometimes called an advocate can really make the difference. It's very hard for parents on their own to objectively know, does my child need extra help, or am I being overprotective? Am I being a helicopter parent? Am I too anxious? Am I overly concerned? It's very hard to sort that out as a parent. I'm a parent of two sons, and I can tell you, even as a professional special educator, it was hard for me to trust my own judgment about one of my sons who was struggling with his reading to an extent and not performing as my wife and I thought he should be, but it was very hard to sort out. Are we being overprotective? Are we asking too much? Or maybe we're asking too little. Maybe we're not being advocates enough for the child. So to have an objective third party who's a professional take a real hard look at the student's records, observe the student, speak with other professionals, and then come to the meeting with the parent, that is extremely helpful in really sorting out what's the right way to go. How much should we be asking for? Does this child qualify for an IEP or 504, or do they need just maybe some what's called best practices within the classroom to help the child, and they don't need a special plan?
But even under the 504 and IEP plan, there is emotional 504 plan, like taking a built-in sensory break in the counselor's office, okay? And then there is the IEP emotional disability or other health impairment categories. Like I don't like the word disability, but that's how it is categorized. What is the difference between these two? And is there a stigma associated with tagging your kid as emotional disability under the IEP plan?
The same student who's having emotional challenges might qualify for a 504 plan, and maybe, like you said, they need sensory breaks, they need maybe a flash pass so they can leave the classroom if they're escalating. They might need periodic breaks. All those things might be enough. Where the IEP would come in again is, does this student need to be taught how to regulate their emotions, how to recognize themselves when they're escalating, how to advocate for themselves, to ask for help when they feel themselves escalating, choosing an appropriate coping strategy when that escalation is taking place. Those are all things that the student would learn from direct instruction through an IEP. Your question about is there a downside, is there a negative to having your child identified with an emotional disability or even with an emotional diagnosis that would lead to a 504 plan? First of all, it's confidential. These plans are confidential, and the people who would know about it are the people who would be
In the
serving the
meeting.
student, at the school, or other people with a need to know. In my mind, whether it's a negative thing or a positive thing really depends on the outcome.
Yeah.
When are you, by having this identification. Are you getting your child the help they need that's going to really allow them to make progress? Or on the other hand, are they being assigned to a class with lots of behavior problems where they're removed from the instruction with the other students? That could be a very negative thing. So it's really to look at what are the resources the school can provide, does provide for kids, and how will my advocating for this identification, will that lead to a positive outcome for my child or not? I've been on both sides of that in my career. I've seen children placed in programs that I think were detrimental to them. And I have fought very hard and advocated for students so they got the right resources, right supports, placement in the right program for the same issues. So it really depends on the outcome is for the child. And to know that, to even know what's going to happen if I advocate for the school system identifying my child with an emotion disability, what is the outcome going to be? What resources and programs does the school have? Again, that's where a professional can help the parent know, well, actually this school system has a wonderful program, and they don't talk about it unless you are in a meeting and you're specifically asking about it, but that could be a wonderful outcome for your child. That's the kind of help a professional can give.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. And I love that perspective. Talking about long-term impacts as well, I know we talked about how they're going to place the kid in the class, but when you're applying for high school admissions, college admissions, you have to mention that you are on an IEP plan, or it somehow comes on the application. Does that impact your application and your chances of getting into a good college? Are colleges wary of such students?
So there's two ways to answer that. One is that it is confidential information, and a student and or their parents do not have to reveal that the child had an IEP when they're applying to college. That's something, yes, that can be kept confidential. On the other hand, though, I'm very much for making sure the college that the child is going to be accepted to is a college that is going to meet the child's needs. When a young adult arrives at college, they have to decide whether or not to let the disability center at that college know that they have been diagnosed with a disability. And if they do that, they are eligible for 504 protections. And at the college level, it's just 504. It's not IEP at that level.
Makes sense.
But, the child has to decide, am I willing to do it? Is this going to be beneficial to me? There are many accommodations that young adults can have in college that are beneficial to them if they're willing to identify themselves and advocate for themselves. So, that, I don't know if I answered your question, but there's a right to keep it private, but that can sometimes be a disservice to the child because they may not get the help they need by keeping it private.
But I mean, for someone who's applying to a college, in their application, if they mention that they have this disability and they're already on an IEP or 504 plan at school, and I know private colleges, you don't really understand the admission process, like what goes on behind. But do colleges reject such applications, or how does it work? Because it can also do a disservice in the other way, right?
Sure. And you're dealing with potential bias. I mean, it is inappropriate discrimination to say a child's not appropriate because they have had an IEP. But, and it's a big but, colleges are going to look at, is this applicant going to be successful with our program? And if the IEP means that the child, previously was in a special class where they received a lot of support from a teacher, and now we're expecting them to function independently, that might not be an appropriate child for the university. So the university has to consider that. But again, it goes back to match between the child and the college and making sure the college can provide the supports the child needs. In my experience working as an advocate, a lot of parents worry about, if my 10-year-old is identified for an IEP, it's going to hurt their chances of college. I see it just the opposite way. If they're identified for an IEP and now have 7 or 8 years to work on improving their skills, they may be ready for a much greater college experience, much more independent when the time comes, because they've had a chance to improve their skills in whatever areas were impacted.
The fact that they don't have to disclose it makes it even better. Yes. It's a win-win situation. So, do these accommodations actually carry forward with you, say in middle school, high school, college board, if you need extra time on SATs, if you get it during elementary school or say later on?
So as far as the IEP goes or the 504 goes, they're both 1 year at a time. So there is an annual review every year to say, does the child still need the same plan that they had before? Hopefully they're growing, and maybe the accommodation, for example, students who have a writing disability. Well, as a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, they may need someone to take dictation from them to get their thoughts out. But hopefully, as they move to be a 9, 10, 11-year-old, they've learned to use a computer. And rather than having dictation as an accommodation, they are now ready to have access to a computer as an accommodation. Some accommodations are going to go away over the years because the child has made growth and they no longer need them. The same thing with IEP goals. Some of those goals are going to be achieved, and now we set higher level goals. And maybe at some point the child no longer needs an IEP, and a 504 plan is now appropriate just to have accommodation. So it's a 1 year at a time look at what's needed. The College Board, you mentioned SATs, that's a whole nother topic. The College Board makes their own decision about whether to grant accommodations or not, but they base that decision on what has been going on in the schools. So if the child has a history of needing 50% extended time, and it's clear that that's been well thought out and the child really uses that accommodation, it's much more likely the College Board is going to allow that accommodation. But that's a separate process for the College Board to approve it or disapprove of it.
Wow. So it's an annual review, and the parents have to work hard every year to advocate for their kids, which sounds very exhausting.
It does, but the other thing to remember is that it's not always an adversarial situation. So often we can have a meeting of the minds that school team and parents and whoever the parents are bringing to the meeting, we're all in agreement. We see this child has ADHD. We see that these certain things are going to work for this child. And when it comes to the annual review, we might tweak it a little bit, but it's not a big battle necessarily. I find that most educators went into teaching because they care about kids. They want to do the best for kids. And so once we really have a good joint understanding of who this child is and what their strengths are, what their needs are, then a lot of the adversarial nature goes away and we can work together on the best interests of the child. That's the goal.
So the public school system sometimes is understaffed. They may not have the speech therapist, occupational therapist, behavior therapist that they promise to provide to your child, which means that your child may go without therapy for months and then you're kind of left with no help. What are some of the things that parents can do in these situations? Because sometimes the school just says, we just don't have the money to staff another person, or we can't find someone.
So there are definite protections within the special ed law. So if your child has an IEP, and the IEP will then say, okay, they have these 3 goals in speech, and they are to receive speech 45 minutes a week. If there's not a speech pathologist for a certain amount of time in the school, and that 45 minutes a week is not happening, there's something called compensatory services within the law, where the school owes the child the services that were not provided if they caused the child not to make progress. And that sometimes that's a test where we have to show, yes, they would have made progress with the services. They're clearly not making them without. But parents have a right to those compensatory services for their child. And sometimes they need to understand that right or assert that right, have an advocate to help them, or have a special education attorney to help them. But I want to say often if the school is asked, what about compensatory services? They typically are going to say, yes, we missed 8 weeks of speech services. We're going to make up that time. And then, and last thing I'll say about this, the time could be made up by sessions in school, maybe doubling up on the sessions that were missed. Also, sometimes the school system gives parents a monetary so the
To go
parents can
outside.
pursue the services outside of school. Yes.
Okay. I mean, in terms of accommodations, when you're sitting in that meeting, a principal, teachers kind of agree to all these accommodations. But then when you get the official document, it's kind of watered down. It's not exactly what was agreed verbally. What do parents do in such a situation? Should they just not sign? How do you handle such a situation?
Well, first of all, as advocates, we're very thorough. We come into the meeting with requests that we believe the child needs these accommodations or these goals in an IEP. We get agreement with the school on whichever ones we get agreement with, hopefully on most of them.
Yeah.
Of course, we take scrupulous notes about all of that. And then it's extremely important when the plan comes home, whether it's a 504 and IEP, we go over that line by line. You know, we agreed in the meeting it was going to be 50% extended time. This says 25% extended time. We were that specific. We will make sure everything that was agreed to in the meeting lines up with what the plan says. And if it doesn't, then we make the school aware that certain things were missed that were agreed to, and we expect those things to be corrected. And usually they are, unless there was a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. You're right, parents cannot sign. In some states like Maryland, if parents only sign the first IEP, so they sign whether or not the child begins on the IEP. After that, each year when the school meets to do the annual review, parent signature is not required. So that's a misunderstanding some parents have. In some states it is required every year, like Virginia is a state where it's required every year, but Maryland not. In Maryland and other states where it's not required, if parents disagree with what the plan is, they then have to engage in a dispute, which is the first step is always make the school aware of what you think they're not doing, and maybe they'll correct it. The second step would be to either file for mediation or go to a due process hearing or some type of administrative complaint.
What is the prior written notice? Apparently, that is something that can help, like that protects parents.
Yes. So to stay with the example you just gave, during a meeting, there will be verbal agreements. We'll have this accommodation. We'll have this goal. The school then sends, along with the document, the 504 plan or the IEP, the school will send home what's called prior written notice. And this is notice of what actions were agreed to and what actions were disagreed to. So that is a narrative documentation of parents asked for 100% extended time. We agreed to 50%. Whatever was decided at the meeting is spelled out in this prior written notice. And again, parents, along with their advocate or attorney, if they have one, will carefully go over that prior written notice to say, did it accurately
Sum up everything, yeah.
exactly what we were talking about the meeting? And it's important for someone, from the parent team to take notes and make sure that it really does line up.
Wow. So if someone who doesn't know about the prior written notice has signed the IEP plan, thinking that, I don't know, they may actually do it, even though I'm signing this, can you go back and fix this issue? Requesting a prior written notice? Like, what is your recourse in that
The
situation?
prior written notice is not something that parents need to request. It is to be done at every IEP meeting. So every IEP meeting, the document comes home and something right up top that says prior written notice comes home to parents. If that doesn't come home, that's a violation of the special ed law, and that parents can take action around that. But also your question suggests, what if parents make a mistake and don't catch something? Parents have 2 years to file a dispute action, whether it be a mediation or a due process hearing, to say that we were promised and that was not in the plan. And it took us a while before we realized that, or we thought it wasn't important, but then we realized it was important. So it was 2 years to make those corrections.
Regarding college, do we have accommodations in the United States for children who have these disabilities at the college level?
We do. As I mentioned, the 504 plan,
Is the only
colleges can provide a 504 plan. So again, if you think about the differences between a 504 and an IEP that I was discussing, colleges are not going to provide an IEP where a student has goals and objectives and meets with a special educator. Now, there is a very few colleges that are set up like that, but the colleges that most of us would be thinking about that are the famous colleges are not going to have an IEP. But if a child has has a documented diagnosis, ADHD, a learning disability, an emotional disability, hearing impairment, a visual impairment. If a child has a diagnosis, they can still assert their right to a 504 plan. The college decides whether or not they qualify. And I'll give you a quick example of someone in my family. The first college he went to said yes. Then he transferred to another well-known college, and they said no based on the same facts. So it's not a slam
One
dunk that
size fits all.
colleges can make their own decision. But if the college does approve the 504 plan, then there are many accommodations, extended time, preferential seating, having only one exam on a day, not to have multiple exams on the same day. One of the accommodations that I've seen that are really beneficial to certain students is allowing them to schedule their courses in advance of other students or with the first groups of students. Advantage being there, spreading out the courses so they're not all on one day, or if they know that an 8 a.m. class is going to be extremely difficult for them, not scheduling any 8 a.m. classes. So that early scheduling can be very, very positive. Living arrangements. Some students qualify for their own room because of their needs related to their disability rather than sharing a room with another student or students.
What is one thing that you see parents miss very often and kind of help them with that?
I can think of several things. Let me mention a couple. Probably the biggest thing I'd like to emphasize to parents is to focus on the strengths. Even though we all worry all the time about what our kids can't do and might not be able to do and what the outcome could be for them in 10 years when they go to college, or focus on what your child does well and help them to develop that strength.
Yeah.
Help and find ways for you to nurture that strength. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, if they're going to be a success in life, it's probably going to be in that strength area.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to give them as many opportunities to do that. And I just as an example, I've seen parents, rather than hire a tutor for what the child couldn't do, hire a mentor to help the child learn more about what they're really good at.
Wow. I love that.
Thank you.
That's amazing. While you were speaking, Rich, I just remembered one more question I have is in these meetings, sometimes the teachers and the principal would kind of say that we provide these plans only for students who are struggling and we want to get them to the average in the class. It's very rare that they will agree to make accommodations for someone who is doing well, but they're doing well because they're putting in that extra effort, whether it's taking tutoring outside of school or at home. And this has nothing to do with the emotional regulation or anything. They just find it more difficult to perform with just what's being taught in class. In that situation, how do you convince a teacher or a principal that, like, no, they need that extra help and they're only doing well because they're getting this extra? And is there a thing, can they just refuse it saying that we only provide it to students who are below average?
Yeah, so that it's a complicated question because especially with the 504 plan, we are looking at how does the average student do? How does the typical student do? So in some ways, it may be more difficult if that is strictly interpreted for a twice exceptional kid to qualify for a 504 plan, because even with their challenges, they may be doing as well as a typical student. When you look at an IEP, though, it should really be how is the student doing compared to what they're capable of. So now you're looking at a student who has superior verbal abilities but is reading in the low average range. There's a disparity there. Or maybe the academics are all fine, but their executive functioning is really impacted. Their ability to start a task, stay on task, stay organized. It's really important to look at what are the supports in place that are making the student function as well as they are functioning. So, often students look like they're performing okay in school, but it's because the parents are sitting with them every night for homework. And instead of doing the 1 hour of homework, the other students they're doing 4 hours of homework, and they're having tutoring multiple times a week. The law is very clear that we have to look at what supports are in place that are helping the student to function at the level that they are functioning, and what would it be like if those supports were removed. And that even goes for medication. A lot of students with ADHD, for example, may look fine in school every day, but what would it look like without the medication? And there's no guarantee that they will continue on the medication because, first of all, that's a personal family decision whether or not to have a child on medication. It's not something a school could ever mandate. Secondly, there may be side effects. There may be a reason that the family changes their mind and says, it's not worth continuing her on this medication because she's not eating. She's losing weight. It's harmful to her health. So there's families, that's a family decision, and schools need to look at what would it be like if this child came to school without the outside mitigating circumstances. That's the legal words, mitigating circumstances that are making this child perform at the current level. I would like to say one more thing about twice exceptional. So one of my books is called Smart Kids with Learning Difficulties, and I'm really passionate about these kids. So we have to look at that they're capable of what other kids who are brilliant are capable of. And without some of the obstacles that are present, the other exceptionality, there's no reason they wouldn't be in our top classes, our gifted curriculum, our advanced placement classes in high school. So we really have to look at what are the supports that are needed, both to accommodate for their disabilities so that they can fly at that high level, and also what are the supports that are needed in terms of teaching them the executive functioning skills, the emotional regulation skills, the reading skills, writing skills, whatever it is that is holding them back, that is providing a barrier to them functioning at that high level, which we know that they have the potential for which to function at.
Wow, that makes so much sense. Thank you for this amazing episode. Thank you so much for all this knowledge on navigating IEPs and 504. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. I will be putting Rich's information in the description section below, along with all of his resources. So if you have any questions on this topic or are struggling with dealing with IEP and 504 plans in your school, please reach out to him. He has all the knowledge and help that you need. Thank you again. Until next time.